Thank you for joining us, Dr. Meyer. Could you tell us a little bit about your academic background and at what points your own spiritual journey kind of intertwined with your scientific and philosophical journey?
Well, I did a bachelor's degree in a double degree in physics and in earth sciences, and took a minor in philosophy as an undergraduate. My first job out of university was as a geophysicist for an oil company, where I worked for 4 years doing seismic digital signal processing. And in 19, well, I won't say the year, that will date me, but um, 4 years into that, a conference came to the city where I was working, Dallas, Texas. And it was an extraordinary and unusual conference that had been convened there, of scientists and philosophers discussing the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness, possibly the three greatest scientific issues that lie at the boundary with philosophy. And the conference was divided between scientists and philosophers who had a materialistic worldview and those who had a theistic worldview. And so they were debating these big issues, discussing them from competing philosophical perspectives. And this really was a kind of a turning point for me. I had always been interested in the scientific issues that were at that boundary, at the intersection between science and philosophy. And I was surprised in listening to the conversations that it actually seemed to me that the theists had the intellectual initiative in the discussion. And this was a world class panel. In the cosmology session, there was the astronomer from Caltech, Alan Sandage, was there. He had been expected to sit on the panel with the other materialist, agnostic, atheist scientists, but unexpectedly arose to the podium and sat with the theists. And then in his discussion, explained how the evidence from astrophysics and cosmology was pointing to a beginning to the universe, which had caused him deep soul searching as to his worldview, and was one of the factors that had led him to embrace theism, and which he announced publicly at that time. He also talked about the fine tuning and a number of other things. Um, so that was a kind of an interesting seminal event, because I'd been working for 4 years doing work in applied science. The other thing, that there was a big discussion of the origin of life, and it was acknowledged by panelists on both sides of that worldview divide that we didn't have an adequate chemical evolutionary theory of the origin of life, and that the big problem was the origin of the information that was stored in the DNA molecule and expressed in RNA and in proteins. And and I was intrigued with that. I was doing using an early form of information technology with the digital signal processing that I was doing, and so it was absolutely intriguing to me that this great mystery, the origin of life, was essentially a question of information technology and its origin. And that's where I kind of got hooked on the origin of life problem. There was one of the scientists at that conference was Charles Thaxton, who had been the lead author on a three-author book called The Mystery of Life's Origin, and he happened to be working for a think tank in Dallas. And so I ended up spending a lot of time with him in the ensuing year. And a year later, I went off to Cambridge to do a PhD. Well, initially to do a master's degree. And when I started a PhD, I really wanted to work on this origin of life question, and that's I ended up doing a PhD on origin of life biology in a interdisciplinary history and philosophy of science program at Cambridge. So I'm kind of all mixed up. It's hard to say what I am.
Great. What is intelligent design and how are you mixed up in it?
Well, the how am I mixed up in it's a long story, but a rough and ready definition, intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of living systems and indeed the universe that are best explained by the activity of designing intelligence or a mind or a conscious agent, as opposed to an undirected material process, such as in the case of biological systems, natural selection acting on random mutations, for example. So it's the idea that there is evidence of design in the natural world that can be detected scientifically by considerations of competing explanatory power. Oh, and how did I get mixed up in it? Well, I gave a little bit of that answer by mentioning the work of Charles Thaxton, Walter Bradley, and Roger Olson, who wrote this book, Mystery of Life's Origin. I met them at this conference in Dallas when I was early in my career, and they had written an epilogue to their book was mainly a critique of current chemical evolutionary models for the origin of life, but they had written an epilogue to the book in which they had floated the idea that the information that was stored in the DNA molecule was, which was not submitting to materialistic explanations, might in fact be a consequence of some sort of, as they put it, intelligent cause. Their idea was just intuitively, we know that information is a mind product. Maybe we're barking up the wrong tree, trying to put a square peg in a round hole. Maybe what we're looking at is evidence of intelligent agency, and we need to be open to that when we're constructing theories of origins. And so in their epilogue, they suggested that there was a category of science, which they called origin science, where considerations of intelligent causes or creative intelligence might be a legitimate kind of inference or explanation. And I was that was where I first encountered what we now call the theory of intelligent design. I was intrigued but not fully convinced of their approach. And when I went off to grad school, I wanted to do some more work specifically on the methods of reasoning that are used in historical sciences, and to evaluate whether or not there might in fact be a basis for a scientific case for intelligent design. And that was a lot of part of the set of animating questions that led me to do the work on origin of life biology that I did.
When you say a designer or intelligent design, does that suggest that intelligent design proponents are all theists and or Christians, or is the movement much broader than that?
It's broader than that. And there's a good reason for that, and that is that one of the things I argued, well, in developing, first of all, in intellectual autobiography, as I looked at the methods of reasoning that were employed in historical sciences, in particular in evolutionary biology, I found that there was a very clear set of methodological desiderata that had been articulated first by Charles Lyell and then also by Darwin himself. And the idea, and Lyell put it very succinctly, he said that when we're trying to explain an event in the remote past, we need to look for, and his phrase was, causes now in operation. And that was the idea behind his uniformitarian reasoning, that the present is the key to the past, by which he meant that our present knowledge of cause and effect should guide our reconstruction of what happened in the past. It should guide our assessment of what possible causes are most plausible, because we have knowledge of what different types of causal entities can and cannot produce. So as I began to think about that, at a certain point I realized, I asked myself a question: well, what are the causes now in operation for the production of digital information? Because that's essentially what we have in DNA and RNA. And there was a early proponent, or early pioneer rather, in the application of information theoretic concepts to the analysis of molecular biological systems. His name was Henry Quasler. And he, in an offhand moment, observed that the production of information, of new information, is habitually associated with conscious activity. And so I thought, well, wait a minute, if you apply the Lyellian dictum to that observation, we have an answer to the question: what are the causes now in operation for the production of information? We have our uniform and repeated experience habitually our habitual association is between the activity of a mind and the generation of information in a digital, typographic, or alphabetic form, what we call in a more technical context specified complexity or specified information. And so I realized at that point that by following the standard methods of scientific reasoning, historical scientific reasoning that had been developed by figures in the 19th century like Lyell and Darwin, and which methods are still used today, it was possible to make a strong historical scientific inference and case for the idea that intelligent design had been responsible, or an intelligent agency or conscious activity had been responsible for the development of the information that's necessary to produce the first life. Now, in making that inference, I'm inferring to a mind of some kind, and we have direct introspective knowledge of the existence of conscious agency because we are conscious agents, and we know of what it is like to be a conscious agent from that introspective experience. We also have knowledge of what conscious agents can do, and we also know some things that conscious agents can do that undirected material processes or brute matter cannot do. And so all of that background knowledge makes it possible to infer to the activity of a mind of some kind, one with at least the capabilities of our own minds based on the specific effects that we may find in the natural world, whether it's an inscription on something like the Rosetta Stone, or whether it's a piece of computer code, or whether it's the information that we find in DNA. So as a first step in evaluating the ultimate origins question, the origin of life, I argued in my first book, Signature in the Cell, that we can infer to a mind of some kind. Now, at that point, there's a number of different metaphysical options as to the identity of that designing intelligence, and that's why there are proponents of intelligent design who are theologically agnostic, some who have proposed designers other than God, but I am a theist, and in my most recent book, I explain the reasons that some of my reasons for being a theist, including the scientific reasons, because I think there's other evidence that bears on the question of the identity of the designing intelligence. But if you just look at the biology, it's possible that the intelligence responsible for life might be a transcendent intelligence of the type affirmed by, for traditional theists, or it might be an immanent intelligence within the cosmos. And there have been scientists who have proposed this somewhat exotic theory called panspermia, the idea that life on Earth was seeded here by an intelligent agent from somewhere out in space. No less a personage than Francis Crick at one point floated that idea, although I think later he regretted it and said he wouldn't make any more speculations on the origin of life problem. It was so difficult. But anyway, so not all proponents of intelligent design are theists, but I happen to be a theist and a proponent of intelligent design.
So panspermia is a very intelligent way to say aliens.
Well, it is exactly that. Yeah, when you say it, it's a little, it seems exotic. Okay, and but you may remember that Richard Dawkins floated this idea in an interview with Ben Stein in the film Expelled several years ago. And he definitely later came to regret it. And I think he even claimed he was somehow trapped into saying this. When you watch the interview, it's hard to see how he was trapped, because Ben Stein sat there very quietly, allowing him plenty of rope with which to hang himself. Ben Stein asked him, well, what are the odds that intelligent design could have something to do with the problem of the origin of life? Because Dawkins had just admitted that no one knows how the first cell arose. And he said, well, it could be that, and then he went on to speculate that, yes, intelligent design might have played a role in the origin of life, but it would have been through, a strictly rational, explicable process, that a life form on another planet evolved through an undirected material process, and then that intelligent being designed life and seeded it to planet Earth. As I say, I think he later either retracted that or regretted it or whatever, but it has been. Fred Hoyle considered that possibility. There have been some serious scientists who have floated it, and Crick was the first in his little book Life Itself in 1981, and then later uh, said he would offer no more speculation about the origin of life problem. It was just simply too hard.
Speaking of Richard Dawkins, say you had an elevator pitch or you had like 30 minutes with him to sit down and talk about the best evidence for intelligent design. You've talked about it a little bit, but what would be the first things you'd want to marshal in your defense?
Well, I don't really have any great desire to have a long conversation with Professor Dawkins. We offered several times the opportunity for public conversations. He did take one with John Lennox, but he was on a national talk show that's based here in Seattle with Michael Medved, and someone called in and suggested that he do a debate or a discussion with me, and he said that he said he would not do it. He said, "Your people haven't earned it," he said. So anyway, I think Professor Dawkins has slightly overplayed his hand with his rabid scientific atheism. And I don't think that the so-called new atheists are in any way winning the argument. And they had a lot of momentum around 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, but I think they've massively overplayed their hand. And I think actually on merits, the proponents of intelligent design and the broader, I think, theistic interpretation of scientific evidence is beginning to win the day. Scientific atheism has become very weird. We often judge the merits of a hypothesis. One among many criteria for judging the merits of a hypothesis is the degree to which it is parsimonious, that it does not multiply endlessly unnecessary theoretical postulates or entities, the Occam's razor principle. But scientific atheism, in order to save the appearances, to explain the data, has had to invent increasingly exotic postulations. So when you have we were just talking about one, you've got the evidence of the digital code in the DNA, and this has not been well explained by chance or necessity, physical chemical necessity, or prebiotic natural selection, or the RNA world, or many different attempts have been made to explain this naturalistically, and they've failed. And so scientific atheists have been forced to posit space alien designers. And then when it seems as exotic to their listeners as it is, well, then they backtrack and say, well, we weren't serious, or we were cornered into saying that. We have the problem of the fine tuning, and scientific atheists have posited instead of a fine tuner, they've posited the multiverse, the idea that there's billions and billions and billions of other universes out there, so many in fact that eventually in some universe the right combination of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe arose, and we just happen to be in the lucky one. But then it comes out that for the multiverse hypothesis to be plausible, there must be a universe generating mechanism. Two have been proposed, one based on string theory and another based on inflationary cosmology. And it turns out that for those mechanisms to be viable, or for them to plausibly have the capability of generating new universes, they themselves would have to be exquisitely finely tuned. So fine tuning elicits the multiverse hypothesis, which in turn depends upon prior unexplained fine tuning, and you're right back to where you started. In cosmology, we've gone from the evidence of a beginning and the development of a new cosmological argument for the existence of God to people like Lawrence Krauss and Hawking and Velinsky proposing basically what in Krauss's formulation, a universe from nothing. And this is the go-to atheistic argument now, is the universe came from nothing, and nothing but pre-existing immaterial laws of physics. So you actually have a material universe coming out of math. I show in the book that either that's incoherent or it actually, I think it actually could be coherent, but only if those pre-existing physical laws that pre-exist any material substrate exist in a mind, and then you're back to a form of theism. So I think the big questions about origins, and I would throw into that the question of consciousness itself, are things that materialism is simply failing to explain, and and the materialists are groping. And so I don't actually think the conversation with the hardline scientific materialists is that fruitful anymore. I think they're past their pull date, and I think the discussion is moving on beyond them.
Speaking of evidences for design, there's a lot of talk about the Cambrian explosion, and you talk about that a lot, especially in your book, Darwin's Doubt. What is the Cambrian explosion, and why is it considered such a good piece of evidence for intelligent design?
Well, the Cambrian explosion refers to the geologically abrupt appearance of the majority of animal body plans, that the geologically abrupt appearance of a whole range of animal forms which exemplify uh, distinct body plans. In fact, the majority of the body plans that have ever existed on planet Earth. So it's an event in the history of life that displays an abrupt appearance of a huge amount of morphological innovation, new forms of life for which there were no antecedents in the earlier Precambrian strata. If you look at the strata below the strata where these new forms arise, there are no discernible connections between those forms and anything that went before. And so this is a really dramatic uh, uh, disconfirmation of the Darwinian gradualistic picture or depiction of the history of life. It's not what you would expect on the basis of Darwinian gradualism, where you would expect instead the tree-like picture of the history of life suggests a continuous morphing and changing from simple forms into more complex forms. And we just simply don't see those intermediates in the fossil record, especially as the fossil record is attesting to the abrupt appearance of the origin of the major and distinct body plans that arise in the history of life. So in the first instance, it's a challenge to the Darwinian picture of the history of life. It's also a challenge to the Darwinian understanding of the mechanism by which new form has arisen, because the event is geologically abrupt, on the order of about 10 million years, and people have quibbled about that. I think you can actually make a case that in the case of the Cambrian, between 13 and 16 major body plans arise in about a 6 million year window. Others arise in a little wider window. Some have said, well, it may be as much as 25. Some have even argued 40. Doesn't really matter, because it's not only geologically abrupt as a percentage of the history of life on Earth, or the percentage of life of the geological time scale from the beginning of our planet to the present. It's also biologically abrupt. If you analyze um, the origin of these new forms from the standpoint of the Darwinian math that flows out of something like population genetics. Population genetics allows us to calculate how much change should occur in a given amount of time if we know certain factors like the mutation rate, the generation times, and the population sizes. And on any reasonable sort of population genetics analysis, there's not near 60 or 6 million, 10 million, 80 million years is not enough time to develop all the new morphological uh, uh, innovation that arises in the Cambrian. what people typically do to extend the period of the Cambrian is they take different pulses of innovation and group them all and say, well, it all happened in 80 million years. But what's really interesting is the pulse. The pulses are bounded, and you get new forms of life arising at different periods, even during the Cambrian and the Precambrian and the Ediacaran period. But to extend that time to say, well, it was longer than 10 million years, people have had to include multiple separate pulses where you get innovations of multiple separate forms of life. And that's really kind of a cheat. But even if you allow that, it doesn't matter. The time allowed is not enough to generate the amount of new form that arises by reference to the Darwinian mechanism. And we have people working on what we call the waiting times problem. You may remember a few years ago that Michael Behe wrote some things about the waiting times with respect to human origins, and said to get two coordinated mutations in the hominid line, you would need about 500 million years, he calculated in his book, The Edge of Evolution. And two mathematical biologists at Cornell said, no, Behe, that can't be right. And they recalculated and said, oh, yeah, Behe's wrong. It isn't 500 million years. Behe may have even calculated it at a billion. I can't remember the exact figure. Doesn't matter. They came back and said, no, it's 200 million. Well, the point is moot, because according to evolutionary phylogenies, humans and chimps diverged from their common ancestor about 5 to 6 million years ago. So this waiting times problem is quite acute up and down the fossil record. We have some really important work going on that with Gunter Bechly, the German paleontologist, working with Richard Sternberg and Ola Husserö. Husserö is a first-rate population geneticist, mathematician from University of Stockholm, and they'll have some stuff coming out on this. But you take anything like any anatomical innovation, for example, the feather of a bird, or some of the anatomical characters that make aquatic mammals different than terrestrial mammals, and you do a waiting times analysis on it, and you find that the expected waiting times are far beyond what's allowed in the fossil record. And that problem applies in spades to the Cambrian explosion, irrespective of whether you date it as I do and most paleontologists do, as about a 10 million year event, or whether you open up the window through various sleights of hand and say, well, it's 80 million years. Doesn't matter. It's not nearly enough time. So that's the second challenge. And I still haven't answered your question, because you asked, well, why does it suggest intelligent design? It's, just to be clear, it's a challenge to the Darwinian picture of the history of life, to the gradualistic picture of the history of life. It's a challenge to the efficacy of the Darwinian and other evolutionary mechanisms, for reasons of, among others, for lack of waiting, an inadequate amount of time. But and actually, in my book Darwin's Doubt, I go through 3 or 4 other challenges to the adequacy of the current evolutionary mechanisms. I was speaking in your beginning part for your special viewers about the problem of developmental gene regulatory networks, the circuitry that's required to build new animal forms. That's another separate problem. So there are multiple problems with the efficacy of the Darwinian mechanism and other evolutionary mechanisms. But on the alternative side, the features that make the Cambrian explosion possible are features of life that we know from other experience are, let me put it differently, that in order to build new forms of life, the key things that we've learned since the molecular biological revolution is that we need new information. In our computer world, we know that if you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to give it new lines of code. Same thing is true in the biological realm. If you want to build a new animal form, if you want to build a trilobite or a brachiopod, or one of the forms that arises in the Cambrian that was not present in the Precambrian, there has to be information for building those forms of life. And the origin of information is a huge problem for Darwinian and other evolutionary mechanisms. And yet we do know of a cause that generates information, functional information, and that is intelligent agency. So those big infusions or bursts or increases in the information content of the biosphere that occur at those points of morphological innovation in the fossil record, I think are plausibly and better explained as acts of mind, as the 19th century paleontologist Louis Agassiz used to put it.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.